Well, welcome to this session of the Church History Symposium. This session is called Exploring Religious Rights and Responsibilities in the U.S. Legal System. My name is Brian Passantino. I'm a research consultant at the Church History Library, and I'm really excited to be moderating this session. We have a great slate of presenters today. I'm going to go ahead and introduce all three of them, and in the order that they will be presenting, and then we will go from there. So first we have Brett G. Scharffs. He's a Rex E. Lee Chair, a professor of law at the J. Reuben Clark Law School, and was appointed director of the law school's International Center for Law and Religion Studies effective May 1st, 2016. He had served the center as associate director and regional advisor for Asia since 2009, and the law school as both associate dean of academic affairs and associate dean for faculty curriculum. Formerly Francis R. Kirkham Professor of Law, Professor Scharffs was appointed on September 1st, 2017 to the law school's Rex E. Lee Chair. Professor Scharffs' teaching and scholarly interests include law and religion, legal reasoning and rhetoric, philosophy of law, and legislation and regulation. He's a graduate of Georgetown University, where he received a BS/BA in international business and an MA in philosophy. He was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University, where he earned a B.Phil in philosophy. He received his J.D. from Yale Law School, where he was senior editor of the Yale Law Journal. He's married to Deirdre Mason Crane Scharffs and has 3 children, Elliot, who is married to Whitley, Sophelia, and Ella. He enjoys golf, skiing, mountain biking with family and friends. So we'll go ahead and turn the time over to Brett for the first presentation.
Good morning, everyone. It's my honor and pleasure to be here. This is the first time I've participated in the Church History Symposium, and so it's a special pleasure. I'd like to thank the organizers for this year's topic, which is right in the wheelhouse of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. Our mission is to promote freedom of religion and belief for all people in all places. And we do this in part through advocating for human dignity of everyone, everywhere. The title of my presentation today is The Journey from Persecution to Inclusion. And this arose several years ago when I was invited by Baroness Emma Nicholson of Winterbourne from the House of Lords in the United Kingdom, who's also the chair of the Amar Foundation, a charity that strives to build and improve the lives and livelihoods of some of the world's poorest and most disadvantaged people, to participate in a conference in Baghdad, Iraq, focusing on the latest wave of persecution faced by the Yazidi people, a minority religion that has suffered a long history of misunderstanding, persecution, and even attempted genocides. Along with several ecclesiastical and humanitarian leaders from the Church of Jesus Christ, we were asked to share the experience of the journey from persecution to participation and inclusion of the Latter-day Saints in America, with the hope that there might be ideas or insights that could assist the Yazidi people in navigating their journey. Elder Anthony D. Perkins of the Quorum of the 70 of the Church and Sharon Eubank, president of LDS Charities, also participated in the conference in Baghdad. And my thinking about the journey from persecution to inclusion is deeply indebted to and builds upon the presentations they made at that conference. Elder Perkins began by telling the story of the church, the revelation to Joseph Smith in 1820, the persecution that soon followed, and the founding of the church in 1830. This history does not need elucidation, elaboration for this audience, but it's clear that over the next 17 years, intense religious persecution resulted in, depending on how you count, 4 or 5 major forced migrations of church members. Thousands of people walked thousands of miles to find refuge from religious persecution and to exercise religious freedom. In 1831, church members were forced to move westward from New York and settled in Ohio, where work on a sacred temple began in Kirtland. Persecution of church leaders and members soon became intense. And in 1838, church members remaining in Kirtland fled to Missouri, where 1835, I think I have a misprint, church members remaining in Kirtland fled to Missouri, where other Latter-day Saints had begun to gather in 1831. However, by 1838, the saints in Missouri had already endured much violent persecution by hostile neighbors who had driven them from their land, destroyed their property, and physically attacked them. In October 1838, Missouri Governor Liburn Boggs issued the extermination order, declaring the Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state. Emboldened by the sanction of law, persecution in Missouri increased. And a mob massacred 17 Latter-day Saint men at Haun's Mill. Joseph Smith and several close associates were imprisoned in the ironically named Liberty Jail, where they suffered a bitter winter while church members were forced to flee the state. In 1839, church members began to turn a marshland on the bank of the Mississippi River into a beautiful city, Nauvoo. Once again, work began on a sacred temple. By 1844, persecution raged anew. The governor of Illinois placed Joseph in jail, where he and his brother Hiram were murdered by a mob covered in blackface, while ostensibly under state protection. Latter-day Saints considered Hiram and Joseph to be martyrs for their faith. In 1845, in the face of continued persecution, church members abandoned their homes in Nauvoo and traveled west under the leadership of Brigham Young. Their forced migration took them to Utah, where they arrived in 1847. Over the next 2 decades, tens of thousands of Latter-day Saints migrated by wagon and foot to the Utah Territory. Because of the hardships and deprivations of the trail, many buried family members on the prairie. And so what we see is over the first 20 years of the church's existence, the church was forced to migrate time and again. Even after arriving in Utah, the church and its members suffered persecution at the hands of the U.S. government. In 1852, based upon false rumors, the President of the United States sent the U.S. Army to Utah to put down an alleged but non-existent rebellion. During the late 1880s, Congress passed laws to break the church financially, due partly to some church members' practice of polygamy, placing church leaders in prison, culminating in a Supreme Court case upholding the seizure of the church's property and assets. Really, it wasn't until the Smoot hearings in 1903 through 1907 that the process of integrating Latter-day Saints into the United States really began to take place, about 75 years after the church was officially organized. As this brief sketch illustrates, the answer to the question, the church suffered about 75 years of severe persecution. The answer to the question is why is complex and mostly beyond the scope of this presentation. Factors included differences of religious belief, differences in religious practices, and some fears of political influence by the church. At this conference in Baghdad, I learned a lot about the Yazidi and their history of persecution. It is an ancient, non-Abrahamic faith that blends elements of Islam, Christianity, and ancient Persian traditions. They have falsely been characterized as devil worshippers, an accusation, interestingly, that was also made against Latter-day Saints in the early history of the Church of Jesus Christ. In 2014 and 15, there was the latest in a long line of attempted genocides at the hands of ISIS. And at that conference, I heard testimonies from a number of people who had suffered from that persecution, including the Yazidi girl who had been sold into sexual slavery. Under Islamic law, you can have more than one wife, and one of the things that happens is men will pass along wives from one man to another in time. And this girl had been handed to about the fourth husband, and while she was being raped, she had this sense that she recognized him, and she couldn't figure it out. But several days later, she realized he was the family dentist. This is someone who, prior to the escalation of antagonism, had been a neighbor, someone who had provided services to the family. And this story had a really big impact on me because I think had a tendency to think of persecution as something that is distant and far away. but it turns out that persecution takes place mostly close at hand. And so I began focusing on some of the main institutions that are involved with religious persecution. And today I'm going to just briefly mention 7 of them and the experience that the Church of Jesus Christ has had with these. As you look at these institutions, the question that I'm most interested in are these institutions the cause of persecution or the solution to persecution? And as we've already seen illustrated by some of the presentations we've already heard yesterday and this morning, the answer, of course, is both. And it's this answer that I'd like to explore briefly. By the state, I mean local, state, national governments, presidents, governors, senators, politicians, political parties. Historically, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has experienced persecution and prejudice by the U.S. government at the local, state, and federal levels. In the early years, local and state government perpetuated persecution against the states, either by failing to provide legal protections or by illegally wielding institutional powers against them. Here we have an image of the appeal to Martin Van Buren. We have the Supreme Court state, which sort of gives away its holding by referring to the late corporation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and also the Smoot hearings. I'm sorry, my slide didn't advance. I need to try a different button. That's the slide I was just talking about. But despite the historical failings of the state, time and mellowing demonstrated that governments also have the power to be a vehicle for eroding prejudice. National temperature towards the saints settled by degrees as saints continued the exposure and had improved public perception. Significantly, today, Latter-day Saints are well represented in government and in legislatures. What about majority faiths? It turns out the majority faiths can be one of the primary instruments of persecution. Recall that for the first abuse that the young Joseph Smith received for his claims of divine revelation was from the clergy of other denominations. Religious prejudice and persecution are not synonymous, but majority faiths have perpetuated both against Latter-day Saints. Sometimes these are overt and serious. Sometimes they are less overt, but still quite serious. But majority faiths can also be a powerful instrument of inclusion. Here I've just included a couple examples, including Richard Mao, the president of the Fuller Theological Seminary, and his book, Talking with Mormons. Also, just in 2019, not very long ago, the first president of the Church of Jesus Christ met with the Pope. The media is a very powerful instrument both of persecution and of inclusion. It's interesting that even as recently as Mitt Romney's presidential campaign, some media outlets used photographs that were designed to create a sense of sinister, shifty untrustworthiness. We also see still popular entertainment that blasphemes what church members hold sacred. And of course, the depiction of the church in the media, especially in the first 75 years of the church's history, was very hostile. But the media is also a force for inclusion. There are some significant milestone moments, such as the 60 Minutes interview with President Hinckley, also his appearances with Larry King, but also a very different type of publication that has become prominent, where more fair-minded and even apologetic literature has been embraced. The persecuted can also contribute to their own persecution. This, of course, is a very sensitive topic because it's all too easy to sort of blame the victim for persecution. But I think the reality is that there were certain things that the Latter-day Saints did, most prominently, of course, the practice of polygamy, but also some of the political insularity and the fear-driven violence, such as the Mountain Meadows Massacre, that I think contributed to the persecution of the Latter-day Saints. The persecuted faith can themselves also be an agent for seeking to improve their inclusion within society. This can be everything from church leaders shaving their beards so they would look more like Americans, but also being involved in service to others. It turns out that one of the ways that persecuted groups find their voice is by standing up for others who suffer persecution as well as themselves. Business, of course, is another instrument both of discrimination and persecution. The early history of the church, of course, is filled with examples of business interests that were hostile to the church and its members. And this may be another area where some of the insularity was self-generated as well, because the church wanted to try to create its own independent economy so that they wouldn't be susceptible to the harm inflicted by others. But over time, there's been a much more inclusive attitude. Indeed, today, there is probably an overrepresentation of Latter-day Saints in high areas of business influence. The last two interest me the most. One is neighbors. One of the most disheartening features of religious persecution is that while we think of it as a distant problem controlled by distant forces, a large part of persecution occurs near at hand, with neighbors persecuting neighbors. This, of course, is something that is somewhat familiar to us even today, but neighbors can also be important instruments of inclusion. Here I have highlighted the church's initiatives and partnerships with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, as well as the Utah Compromise. Academics cuts especially close to home. Academia has spread both notoriety and appreciation of Latter-day Saint tradition, both through positive and defamatory academic writings and the reputation spread by prominent Latter-day Saint scholars. Much of the early academic literature, if you look at 19th century encyclopedias and academic treatises about the church, were very inflammatory, and it would be hard to characterize them as fair-minded. This has changed noticeably over the last 50 years, and perhaps especially in the last 25, as high-quality scholarship has, I think, shifted significantly. So in conclusion, I try to think about this issue quite personally. My thinking about persecution was forever changed when I heard the story of that young Yazidi girl who recognized the man raping her as her family's associate. This suggests that at times of stress, neighbors who have lived together peaceably can turn upon one another. It also illustrates how close to home religious persecution can be. It was in the aftermath of that conference, and reflecting upon the experience of Latter-day Saints, that I saw in an instant of clarity, a little like a light being turned on in a darkened room, that the sources and the solution to persecution are one and the same. Here I have focused on the state, other religious communities, majority religions, the media, the persecuted themselves, business, neighbors, and academics. The roles they play in both persecution and in inclusion. I concluded with academics because I want the implications of the analysis to be personal, since I am an academic who studies law and religion from an international and comparative law perspective. Each of us, from whichever institution we inhabit, is capable, intentionally or unconsciously, of being either a part of the problem or part of the solution. My hope is that that I will be on the side of those who come to the aid of minorities, including religious minorities, who suffer persecution, just as there were those who came to the aid of my own religious community at a time when we were particularly weak and vulnerable. Thank you.
We have a couple minutes for questions. If you'd like to come up here and speak in the microphone and ask questions to our presenters, please go ahead and do that.
I guess I'm curious to hear feedback on what the current climate holds as threats to religious freedom, and what kinds of safeguards or safety measures can we take in our current environment to protect religious freedoms?
I think there's a very broad consensus politically and legally in the United States about the importance of religious freedom as a constitutional right and also as an important American value. There are several trends that give those of us who think about religious freedom all the time pause. Let me just mention a couple of those. One is, in contrast to even as recently as the late 1990s, there is a politicization of religious freedom along party lines that is disconcerting. There used to be a very broad-based bipartisan support for religious freedom. This was seen in the passage of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It was also seen in the passage of the International Religious Freedom Act in the 1990s. Today, polls show that there's a much greater divide between Republicans and Democrats with respect to religious freedom. And this tracks to some extent political divisions on social issues, including same-sex marriage and transgender rights. The second thing we notice is a generational difference. If you look at the public polling on religious freedom, let's call it the post-World War II generation, the baby boom generation, is much more favorably disposed towards religious freedom than the subsequent generations. And it appears that the support for religious freedom goes down through Gen X, millennials, post-millennials. And so the long-term health of social attitudes towards religious freedom is somewhat worrisome. The third thing I would note is a decline in religious affiliation. This is something that is happening across U.S. society. The percentage of people who identify as religious continues to go down, and that's especially acute among younger generations, but not just younger generations. And so, as you might imagine, the interest in religious freedom is higher among those for whom religion is an important part of their identity than for those for whom it is not. The last thing I'll mention is, in the post-World War II period, until the end of the 1990s, the most powerful institution politically in the branches of government that supported religious freedom was Congress. The support of Congress was stronger than the support of the courts, and the support of Congress was stronger in many cases than the executive branch. That has changed significantly. Today, the institution that is most protective of religious freedom is the Supreme Court. And executive branch interest varies based upon party affiliation of the president. And Congress's support for religious freedom has gone down. I view this as a very negative and worrisome trend because I think it's actually when the people's branches of government, Congress especially, has a robust and a dynamic appreciation for religious freedom, that it's most likely to be vindicated and valued. We have a backstop of a Supreme Court that is quite protective of religious freedom, but Supreme Court justices all have an expiration date. They do have lifelong tenure, so we don't tend to feel the thrust of those changes very dramatically. But I worry that we are increasingly reliant upon courts for protecting religious freedom and less reliant upon legislatures. So I think for those of us who care about religious freedom, what we want to do is be mindful of each of those trends to try to find a consensus that is bipartisan, that's cross-generational, and that moves beyond just litigating. I'm a lawyer, so I like litigation, but we want to protect religious freedom not primarily through litigation, but primarily through the culture and the political culture and the social culture that we seek to cultivate in our own communities and in our own spheres of influence.